The Georgia soil is a deep, unforgiving red. In the suffocating heat of August 1823, it clings to everything, to the roots of the cotton stalks, to the floorboards of the slave cabins, and to the sweat-soaked clothes of the men who toiled under a merciless sun. On the Thorn Plantation, a sprawling enterprise of misery called Viridian Manor, the earth kept secrets. It was a silent witness to generations of suffering, a vast, unmarked grave for the hopes of men and women treated as less than human. But on one particular Tuesday, as a field hand named Moses drove his plow through a fallow patch of land near the cypress swamp, the earth decided to speak. The iron blade struck something that wasn't a rock. The sound was a dull, hollow thud, the sound of wood yielding to force. Cursing the interruption, Moses knelt, his calloused fingers digging into the compacted soil. What he unearthed was not a stray root or a buried stone. It was a small, crudely made pine box, no bigger than a shoemaker's last. It was weathered and gray, but the lid was still fastened shut with rusted nails. A strange, primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the afternoon's oppressive heat. This was no ordinary find. It was a coffin built for something impossibly small. With trembling hands, he pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in a tattered piece of linen, lay the skeletal remains of an infant. The sight was horrifying, yet it was only the beginning. As his master, Elias Thorne, was summoned and other hands were put to work, the true macabre nature of this forbidden patch of earth was revealed. Another box was found, then another, and another, each one identical, each one containing the same tragic, silent occupant. This was not a forgotten family plot. This was a collection. A systematic, chilling graveyard of the newborn, hidden away from God and man. The question that hung in the air, more stifling than the Georgia humidity, was not just who these infants were, but who had been putting them there. The answer would unravel the plantation's darkest secret, a secret kept by the one person meant to bring life into this world, not bury it in the cold, red earth. Viridian Manor was a monument to the brutal efficiency of the antebellum South. Its owner, Elias Thorne, was a man carved from the same hard material as his ambitions. He was not known for overt cruelty in the manner of his neighbors, who used the whip as a primary tool of conversation. Thorne preferred a colder, more calculated form of control. He saw his plantation not as a home but as a factory, and his enslaved workers were merely assets, their value meticulously recorded in his ledgers. Every birth was a gain, logged as new property. Every death was a loss, a debit against his potential profits. This rigid economic view of human life was the engine that drove Viridian Manor, but it also created a disturbing paradox. The mortality rate for newborn slaves was tragically high across the South, a grim reality of malnutrition, disease, and grueling labor inflicted upon expectant mothers. Yet on Thorne's plantation, the numbers were, for a time, curiously stable. His records showed a remarkably low rate of stillbirths and infant deaths, a fact he boasted of as proof of his supposedly superior management. He attributed this success to one person, a slave midwife named Phyllis. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom and sorrow of 1,000 years. She was revered by the white families of the county for her skill. To the masters, she was an invaluable asset, a guarantor of future assets. But among her own people, in the hushed whispers of the slave quarters after dark, she was something else entirely. She was a figure of fear, a shadow that fell upon a cabin when a new life was imminent. Mothers who had lost children under her care spoke of a coldness in her touch, a finality in her gaze. They spoke of healthy babies born strong and crying who would inexplicably sicken and vanish within a day. Their deaths were always recorded as a tragic natural loss, a fever, a wasting sickness, a weak heart. But the mothers knew. They felt a horrifying, unspoken truth that they dared not voice aloud. The discovery in the cypress swamp was about to give that truth a voice, and it would scream. Phyllis the midwife was an enigma, a ghost who walked in the daylight. She moved through Viridian Manor with a quiet authority that was unsettling in a person of her station. She was not owned by Elias Thorne. She was, in a strange and complicated arrangement, leased from a neighboring estate. Her services contracted out to the highest bidders across the county. This unique status afforded her a degree of autonomy that was virtually unheard of for an enslaved person. She could travel, albeit with papers, and she entered the homes of the white elite, privy to their most intimate and vulnerable moments. She was literate, a skill she kept carefully hid. And she possessed a profound knowledge of herbalism, of poultices and remedies that could soothe a fever or ease a difficult birth. To the white population, she was a repository of folk wisdom, a granny woman whose skills were both respected and faintly disdained. But her true power, her true terror, lay in the dual nature of her role. She was the arbiter of life and death at its very threshold. On the plantations, her arrival at a cabin was a sign of hope, but it was a hope always tinged with a deep ancestral dread. The enslaved community understood the brutal calculus of their existence. A healthy baby was a future field hand, another body to be broken for profit. But a sickly baby, or one born with a defect, was a liability, a drain on resources, a flaw in the machinery of the plantation. And it was Phyllis who made the initial assessment. It was her word, her quiet pronouncement to the overseer or the master, that often sealed a newborn's fate. Was the child strong, or was it unfortunate? This word, unfortunate, was a death sentence. And in the dark, whispered folklore of the enslaved, it was said that Phyllis was the one who carried it out. She was the one who decided if a child would be a welcome asset or a forbidden burden, buried before it could ever be named. The discovery of the graveyard near the swamp suggested that the number of unfortunate children at Viridian Manor was horrifyingly high. As the grim tally of unearthed coffins grew, a chilling pattern began to emerge. There were 12 of them, 12 identical pine boxes buried in neat, deliberate rows. This was not the work of a panicked mother trying to hide a stillborn child. This was methodical. It was ritualistic. Elias Thorne, a man for whom emotion was a foreign language, felt a flicker of something deeply unsettling. This was not about the loss of life. For him, it was about the destruction of property. 12 potential laborers vanished. That represented a significant financial loss. He summoned his overseer, a coarse and brutal man named Jepson, his face a permanent mask of sunburnt rage. Jepson was Thorne's fist, the instrument of his will, but even he was shaken by the macabre discovery. He had been at Viridian Manor for 5 years, and he had seen death in all its forms. He had seen men collapse from heatstroke in the fields, their bodies barely cold before they were dragged away. He had seen the aftermath of failed escapes, the mangled bodies displayed as a warning, but this was different. This was a secret, a cold case hidden in the earth. Thorne's command was simple and devoid of any humanity: find out who did this. The investigation, if one could call it that, began not with a search for justice, but with a brutal accounting. Jepson started in the slave quarters, his presence casting a pall of terror over the already grieving community. He interrogated the mothers. He dragged them from their cabins, demanding to know about their lost children. But he was met with a wall of silence and fear. They would only repeat the official story, the one Phyllis had given them, the one recorded in the plantation logs. The baby was born weak. The baby had the flux. The baby simply faded. Their eyes, however, told a different story. They were hollowed out by a grief they could not speak of, a horrifying knowledge that was banned from their lips. They would glance nervously toward the woods, toward the small, isolated cabin where Phyllis lived, a place most of them avoided as if it were cursed. Jepson, a man of little intellect but sharp, predatory instincts, noticed the fear. He noticed that the name Phyllis was never spoken, only gestured toward with a flicker of the eyes. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, and it was screaming her name. Jepson's path inevitably led him to the midwife's door. Phyllis's cabin was set apart from the main slave quarters, nestled on the edge of the very swamp where the infants were found. This isolation was a symbol of her status, separate, other, and untouchable. The air around her home was thick with the scent of drying herbs, boneset, snakeroot, and other plants whose names were known only to her. Smoke curled from a clay chimney, carrying with it a smell that was both medicinal and strangely metallic. When Jepsen arrived, she was sitting on her porch calmly grinding something in a stone mortar. She did not look up as he approached, her focus absolute. There was no fear in her posture, only a placid, unnerving stillness. Jepsen, accustomed to inspiring terror, found himself momentarily disarmed. "We found them," he grunted, foregoing any preamble. "The babies. In the swamp." Phyllis continued her grinding, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone the only sound between them. After a long moment, she finally looked up, her gaze direct and unblinking. "The earth must have what it is owed," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Some seeds are not meant to sprout." Her response was not a denial. It wasn't a confession either. It was a proverb, a piece of cryptic folklore that infuriated the literal-minded overseer. He pressed her, his voice rising with frustrated anger. He listed the names of the mothers whose children had died under her care. He described the boxes, the small, skeletal remains. He accused her directly, yet Phyllis remained impassive. She spoke of fate, of bad omens, of spirits that lingered in the swamp and sometimes claimed the souls of the newborn. She deflected every accusation with a chilling piece of folk wisdom, wrapping the truth in a thick blanket of superstition. It was a masterful performance, designed to sound like the ramblings of an old, superstitious woman. But Jepsen saw the intelligence in her eyes, the cold, calculating mind working behind the facade. She was not confessing, but she was not hiding either. She was daring him to understand a truth that was far more disturbing than simple murder, a truth he was not equipped to comprehend. He left her cabin with more questions than answers, the creepy feeling of her calm denial crawling under his skin. He realized this was not just a cold case. It was a curse, and Phyllis was its keeper. The investigation was going nowhere, and Elias Thorne's impatience was turning to cold fury. The loss of property was one thing, but the presence of a secret, systematic killer on his plantation was a threat to his absolute control. A mystery of this magnitude was a crack in the foundation of his tyrannical order. He decided to handle the interrogation of Phyllis himself. He had her brought to the great house, not to the brutal whipping post in the yard, but to his study, a room of polished mahogany, leather-bound books, and the suffocating scent of tobacco and wealth. This was a place of psychological warfare, not physical. He believed he could break her with his intellect, his authority. Phyllis entered the room and stood before his massive desk, her simple homespun dress a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. She was not manacled. She was not visibly afraid. She simply waited, her hands clasped before her, her expression unreadable. Thorne began his questioning, his voice a low, menacing purr. He did not yell like Jepsen. He was methodical, laying out the evidence as a lawyer would: the number of bodies, the location, the fact that all 12 infants had died under her direct care. "These were not acts of God, Phyllis," Thorne stated, leaning forward, his eyes boring into hers. "These were acts of man, or woman." He offered her a deal, a twisted form of plantation clemency. "Confess," he said, "and tell him who else was involved. Was it a conspiracy among the mothers? A rebellion of the most macabre kind?" He was searching for a motive he could understand: revenge, insanity, anything but the chilling void she presented. But Phyllis would not give him the satisfaction. She met his gaze, and for the first time she offered something more than folk proverbs. "There is a mercy worse than the whip, Master Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper but filling the cavernous room. "A life of chains is a long, slow death. Some are not strong enough to bear it from the first breath." The statement was electrifying. It was a confession, but it was also a horrifying accusation aimed directly at him and the entire system he represented. She was claiming to be an angel of mercy. The idea was so audacious, so contrary to the established order of things, that Thorne was momentarily stunned into silence. A slave, justifying the murder of other slaves as an act of kindness. It was unthinkable. And in that moment he realized this was far more complex, far more disturbing than he had ever imagined. The woman standing before him was not just a killer. She was a philosopher of despair, and her logic was born from the very hell he had created. Phyllis's chilling words hung in the air of the study, a direct challenge to Thorne's entire worldview. He was a man who believed in order, in a natural hierarchy where he sat at the top. The idea that one of his slaves could possess not only the agency to kill, but also a coherent, albeit horrifying, moral justification for it was anathema to him. He dismissed her claim of mercy as a desperate lie, a pathetic attempt to mask her inherent savagery. He needed a different motive, one that fit his understanding of the world. And so, his mind turned to something he understood far better than philosophy: money. "You were paid," Thorne accused, his voice regaining its sharp edge. "Someone paid you to do this." He theorized that a rival plantation owner, perhaps one of his many enemies in the county, had orchestrated this macabre plot to sabotage his operations, to sow discord and financial ruin at Viridian Manor. In this version of events, Phyllis was not a misguided angel of mercy, but a simple pawn, a hired killer. It was a comforting thought, as it placed the blame on an external enemy and reduced Phyllis to a mere tool, robbing her of the terrifying agency she had just claimed. He pressed this new line of questioning with renewed vigor. Who approached her? How much were they paying her per child? Where did she hide the money? He promised her protection, a life of ease, if she would only name the conspirator. He was trying to graft a simple, greedy motive onto an act of profound, existential horror. But Phyllis simply shook her head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. It was a smile of pity, not for herself, but for him, for his inability to see the truth that was right in front of him. "The only payment," she said softly, "was the silence that followed, the peace." Her continued defiance pushed Thorne to the edge. His controlled, intellectual approach had failed. He reverted to the base language of his power. He called for Jepson and ordered Phyllis to be taken to the old smokehouse, a dark, windowless brick building used for punishment. She would be deprived of food and water until she gave him the name he wanted to hear. As she was dragged away, her unnerving calm remained intact, a silent testament to a will that Thorne could not comprehend and therefore could not break. He was left alone in his study, the master of a world he suddenly, terrifyingly, no longer understood. The mystery had deepened, spiraling away from a simple cold case into a forbidden realm of slave spirituality and resistance. The smokehouse was a place of sensory deprivation and psychological torment. It was pitch black, silent save for the scuttling of rats, and the air was stale with the lingering ghosts of fear and pain. Here, wills were meant to be broken. Men and women were left in the darkness for days, emerging blinking and compliant, their spirits shattered. Elias Thorne was confident that a few days in this hole would reduce Phyllis's cryptic philosophy to a desperate, screaming confession. He was wrong. Days turned into a week, and the reports from Jepson were always the same. She was silent. She did not cry out, she did not beg for water, she did not rave in the darkness. When Jepson would open the heavy door to taunt her or check on her, he would find her sitting upright, her back against the cold brick wall, as if in meditation. Her stillness was more defiant than any scream. While Phyllis endured her confinement, a strange and subtle shift was occurring in the slave quarters. The initial terror that followed the discovery of the graves was slowly being replaced by something else, a quiet, resentful reverence for the imprisoned midwife. The secret they had all kept out of fear was now a shared burden, and Phyllis's silent suffering in the smokehouse was seen as an act of sacrifice. The mothers who had lost their children began to leave small offerings at the edge of the swamp near her cabin, a bundle of herbs, a piece of cornbread, a carved wooden charm. These were not offerings for a murderer. They were offerings for a priestess, a guardian who had shouldered a terrible responsibility. They were acts of complicity, acknowledgments of a forbidden truth that bound them all together. The folklore that had once painted Phyllis as a creepy, malevolent figure began to change. The whispers now spoke of her not as a baby killer, but as a soul releaser, someone who could send a newborn spirit back to the ancestral lands before it could be trapped in a life of bondage. It was a radical, desperate reframing of unspeakable horror into an act of spiritual resistance. This subtle but powerful shift in the community's sentiment was a dangerous development for Thorne, though he remained blissfully unaware of it. He was trying to solve a crime, but the people he ruled over were in the process of sanctifying the criminal. The curse was taking root. While Elias Thorne focused his efforts on breaking Phillies, a secondary, far more pragmatic investigation was being conducted by his wife, Clara Thorne. A woman overshadowed by her husband's domineering presence, Clara was the mistress of the domestic sphere, and that included the health and well-being of the enslaved women and their children. While Elias saw the dead infants as lost assets, Clara saw them as a failure of her domain, a stain on the household's reputation. She did not believe the lurid tales of a rival planter's conspiracy, nor did she accept Phillies's cryptic talk of mercy. Clara was a practical woman, and she sought a practical explanation. She began by reviewing the plantation's own records, the birthing logs kept by the previous overseer, as well as her own household notes. She cross-referenced the dates of the infant deaths with other events on the plantation, periods of sickness, food shortages, and most importantly, purchases. As she meticulously sifted through the yellowed pages of ledgers and diaries, a disturbing anomaly caught her eye. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. The 12 infant deaths were not randomly distributed. They were clustered. Each death had occurred within a week of Elias Thorne returning from a business trip to Savannah or Charleston. This, in itself, was not conclusive, but then she found the corresponding entries in her husband's private financial ledgers. After each of these trips, there was a small, recurring, and vaguely noted expenditure, procurement of specialized supplies. The cost was always the same. It was a small sum, but it was there, a ghost in the accounting. Clara felt a cold dread creep into her heart. What specialized supplies would be needed after a trip, and why would their procurement coincide so perfectly with the death of a newborn child in the slave quarters? Her mind, trained to manage the logistics of a large household, began to connect dots that no one else had even seen. The investigation was no longer just about Phillies the midwife. It was now pointing inward, toward the heart of Viridian Manor itself, toward the master's study and his meticulously kept, secret-filled books. She was on the verge of uncovering a truth far more horrifying and colder than any tale of swamp spirits or merciful killings. And as a special treat for those of you who have followed us this far into the darkness, we have to ask you to seal your own pact with this channel. If uncovering these forbidden histories is what you seek, then subscribe now. Because the banned truth that Clara Thorne was about to unearth would rewrite the entire story of the Viridian Manor curse. Clara Thorne's discovery of the ledger entries was a key that turned a lock on a forbidden door. The phrase procurement of specialized supplies was chillingly vague. Driven by a mixture of suspicion and a dawning horror, she began a quiet, clandestine search of her husband's study. Elias was a man of strict routine and order. Every book, every paper had its place. To disturb his domain was a significant risk. Late one night while he was sleeping, she slipped into the room, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar space feel alien and menacing. She didn't know what she was looking for precisely. A letter, a receipt, a hidden journal. She started with his correspondence, carefully examining letters from his business associates in Savannah. Most were mundane, discussing cotton prices and shipping logistics. But then she found it, a small, sealed envelope tucked inside a book on animal husbandry. The letter was not from a cotton factor. It was from a man who signed himself only as Dr. Alastair Finch, a physician with an address in a disreputable part of the city. The letter was written in a precise, clinical hand, and its contents made Clara's blood run cold. It was not about medicine for livestock. It was about humans. Finch wrote of the unfortunate but necessary culling of inferior stock to ensure the purity and strength of the primary lineage. He discussed, in detached, scientific terms, the importance of eliminating congenital defects and weak constitutions at the earliest possible stage to avoid wasted investment. He then went on to confirm the shipment of a discreet package containing a tasteless, fast-acting tincture derived from oleander and foxglove, a potent combination of heart-stopping poisons. The letter concluded with a chillingly polite inquiry. I trust your midwife has proven as reliable and discreet as my own in these delicate matters." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her husband, Elias, was not the victim of a conspiracy. He was the architect of it. The specialized supplies were poison. The trips to Savannah were to procure it. Phyllis was not a rogue agent acting on some twisted philosophy of mercy. She was an instrument. She was the executioner, but the order, the motive, the entire horrifying system came directly from the master of the house. The 12 dead infants were not casualties of a rival's plot. They were victims of her husband's cold, calculating, and utterly monstrous eugenics program. The revelation in Dr. Finch's letter shattered Clara Thorne's world. Her husband, the man she knew as a stern but respectable planter, was a monster who practiced a cold, calculated form of infanticide for profit. The Macabre graveyard in the swamp was not a mystery to be solved. It was his creation. The weight of this knowledge was suffocating. She looked at the letter in her hand, the proof of his horrifying crimes, and was paralyzed by a terrible choice. To reveal it would be to destroy her family, her name, her entire existence. Her life of privileged comfort was built upon the foundation of her husband's evil. To expose him would be to bring down the whole rotten structure upon her own head. But to remain silent was to be complicit, to allow the systematic murder of infants to continue under her own roof. The very next day, Clara observed her husband with new, terrified eyes. She saw the way he inspected the enslaved children in the quarters, his gaze, lingering not with affection but with the cold appraisal of a livestock breeder checking his stock. Every smile, every gesture, every word from him was now tainted with the poison he imported. Her revulsion was mixed with a potent, chilling fear. Elias was not a man to be crossed. His control was absolute, his retribution swift and terrible. If he were to discover that she knew his secret, her fate would be unthinkable. She hid the letter, placing it back where she found it, her mind racing. She could not go to the authorities. In 1823 Georgia, the word of a wife against a powerful planter concerning the lives of slaves was worth less than nothing. There was no one she could turn to. The entire system was designed to protect men like Elias Thorne, to render their crimes invisible. She was trapped in the heart of the nightmare, a silent witness to a truth so forbidden that speaking it would be her own death sentence. Her focus shifted from exposing the crime to a desperate, single-minded goal. She had to find a way to stop it. And to do that, she realized, she would have to confront the other person who knew the truth, the woman currently starving in the darkness of the smokehouse. She had to talk to Phyllis. Arranging a secret meeting with Phyllis was a perilous undertaking. Clara had to bribe a trusted house slave to distract the overseer, Jepson, and steal the key to the smokehouse. In the dead of night, under a sliver of moon, she crept out of the great house, her heart pounding with a terror she had never known. The air was thick and still, every snapping twig sounding like a gunshot. The smokehouse door groaned open, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the faint light from her lantern. The stench of despair and unwashed bodies hit her first, and then she saw her. Phyllis was sitting in the corner, gaunt and weakened, but her eyes, when they caught the light, were as sharp and intelligent as ever. She showed no surprise at seeing the mistress of the house standing before her. It was as if she had been expecting her. Clara, her voice a trembling whisper, began to speak. She didn't accuse. She didn't question. She simply stated the truth she had discovered. "The poison," she said, the words feeling like acid on her tongue. "From Dr. Finch in Savannah, my husband, Elias." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Phyllis simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of confirmation. In the flickering lantern light, the midwife's face was a mask of ancient sorrow. "He is a man who likes his garden well tended," Phyllis said, her voice raspy from dehydration. "He pulls the weak sprouts before they can steal nourishment from the strong." The simple, agricultural metaphor was more chilling than any detailed confession. It confirmed the cold, utilitarian nature of the killings. This wasn't about mercy. It wasn't about a curse. It was about agricultural efficiency applied to human beings. Clara felt a wave of nausea. "Why?" she asked, the question a desperate plea for an explanation that could make sense of the monstrosity. "Why would you do it?" He forced you, I know, but... Phyllis cut her off, not with a word, but with a look of profound, weary pity. He signs the order, she whispered. But I am the one who must look into the mother's eyes. I am the one who holds the child. In that moment, the power dynamic between the two women inverted. Clara, the privileged mistress, was helpless and afraid. Phyllis, the enslaved prisoner, was the keeper of the truth, the one who bore the full, horrifying weight of the plantation's deepest sin. Inside the suffocating darkness of the smokehouse, Phyllis began to tell her story, and the narrative of Viridian Manor's curse was rewritten once more. She explained that, when she first arrived at the plantation, Elias Thorne had presented her with a horrifying, non-negotiable directive. He had his theories, gleaned from his books on animal husbandry and his correspondence with men like Dr. Finch. He believed that by systematically eliminating newborns he deemed inferior, those born too small, those with a cough, those who cried too weakly or sometimes, those who were simply the wrong shade of skin for his aesthetic tastes, he could, over generations, breed a stronger, more resilient workforce. It was a long-term investment strategy, a monstrous application of agricultural science to human chattel. He gave Phyllis an impossible choice. She could either be his instrument, administering the poison discreetly and marking the deaths as natural, or he would simply have Jepson handle the matter. The implication was clear. Her way involved a quiet, hidden death. Jepson's way would be brutal and public. A baby drowned in a bucket, a small body broken. It would be done as a spectacle, to terrorize the others into producing better stock. Phyllis chose what she saw as the lesser of two evils. She chose to be the one who administered the tasteless tinct. You're to hold the child and whisper a quiet blessing as its heart slowed and stopped. She chose to spare the mothers the public horror of seeing their children murdered by the overseer. She created the ritual of the small pine boxes and the secret burial ground herself, affording the infants a dignity in death that they were denied in life. It was a horrifying, twisted form of compassion, born from a situation with no good options. I do not give them mercy from a life of bondage, she explained to Clara, her voice a low, steady murmur. I give the mothers mercy from having to watch their children be destroyed like sick animals. I take the sin upon myself, so they do not have to see it. This confession was the most disturbing revelation of all. Phyllis was not a monster, a madwoman, or a mercenary. She was a woman trapped in an unthinkable ethical cage, forced to become a killer to prevent even greater atrocities. Clara Thorne stumbled out of the smokehouse and back into the night, her reality completely upended. The truth was not a simple story of a villain and a victim. It was a complex interlocking machinery of horror, and everyone, including herself, was a cog. Her husband was the architect, Phyllis was the unwilling executioner, and she, with her fine dresses and her well-managed household, was the beneficiary of it all. The cotton in her clothes, the food on her table, the roof over her head, it was all paid for by this systematic hidden slaughter. The knowledge was a poison in her own veins. The next few days passed in a blur of surreal horror. She watched Elias at the dinner table, discussing cotton prices, and saw a mass murderer. She saw the enslaved mothers in the fields and saw a silent sorority of the grieving, their pain knowingly inflicted by the man she slept beside. The entire plantation, which had once seemed a place of order, was now revealed to be a meticulously managed death camp. Her resolve to stop her husband hardened into a desperate, cold determination. But how? Direct confrontation was suicide. The legal system was a dead end. She realized there was only one way to fight a man like Elias Thorne. She had to use his own methods against him. He operated in secrets, lies, and manipulation. She would have to do the same. Her plan began to form, a fragile, dangerous scheme born of desperation. It would not be about justice or exposure. It would be about sabotage. She could not save the dead, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could save the unborn. Her first step was to get Phyllis out of the smokehouse. She went to her husband, her face a carefully constructed mask of wifely concern. She told him that his punishment was working, but that he was going too far. Phyllis was a valuable asset, she argued, using his own language. If the midwife died of starvation, the county would gossip. Questions would be asked. It would be bad for business. Her pragmatic, economic argument appealed to his vanity and his wallet. Grudgingly, Elias agreed. He ordered Phyllis released, convinced that her spirit was broken and she was no longer a threat. He had no idea he was releasing the one woman who, with Clara's help, could bring his entire Macabre enterprise crashing down. Phyllis emerged from the smokehouse, physically weakened but with her indomitable spirit intact. Her release was not a victory, but merely the start of a new, even more dangerous phase of the conflict. She and Clara now formed the most unlikely of alliances, the plantation mistress and the enslaved midwife, united by a shared, horrifying secret and a common enemy. They could not communicate openly. Jepson watched Phyllis constantly, and Elias watched his wife with a new, subtle suspicion. Their conspiracy had to be conducted in a language of silence and subtlety. A specific flower left on a windowsill, a particular hymn hummed by Clara as Phyllis passed by. These were the signals that arranged their clandestine meetings in the dead of night, deep in the woods where no one would see them. In these hushed, frantic encounters, they hatched their plan. It was twofold. First, they had to disrupt the supply of the poison. Clara, using her knowledge of her husband's correspondence, began to intercept the letters to and from Dr. Finch. She would carefully steam them open, read the contents, and then, if necessary, alter them or simply destroy them, claiming they were lost in the mail. It was a simple but effective act of sabotage, creating confusion and delay in Elias' monstrous supply chain. The second part of the plan was more complex and far more dangerous. It involved Phyllis using her deep knowledge of herbalism to fight back. She could not refuse to attend a birth, nor could she openly defy an order from Thorne to deal with an unfortunate infant. To do so would mean her immediate death and the appointment of a more brutal replacement. Instead, she had to play a more subtle game. She began to create her own tinctures. One was a powerful emetic, harmless but designed to make a newborn vomit spectacularly, a sign of supposed sickness that would justify a period of quarantine and observation, buying precious time. Another was a sedative, a mixture of chamomile and valerian root, that would make a healthy baby appear lethargic and weak, subverting Thorne's assessments. She was manipulating the very signs of life and death that Thorne used to make his judgments, turning his own cold science against him. It was a terrifyingly high-stakes game. If she was caught, if a baby died from one of her concoctions, or if Thorne discovered their deception, they would both be destroyed. The silent war at Viridian Manor began. For the next several months, a tense, invisible battle was waged. When a child was born, Phyllis would be summoned and the terrible ritual would commence. Elias Thorne, sometimes present himself, would inspect the newborn with his cold, appraising eye. He would make his pronouncement: this one was strong, a future asset. That one, however, was small, weak, unfortunate. He would give the nod to Phyllis, the silent order to retrieve the specialized supplies. Phyllis, her face an unreadable mask, would acquiesce. She would return with a small vial, but now the contents were her own. Sometimes she would administer the sedative. The baby would become listless, confirming Thorne's diagnosis of weakness. He would leave, satisfied, ordering her to let nature take its course. Once he was gone, Phyllis would work frantically, using her knowledge to revive the child, to stimulate its breathing and warm its body. She would then report, a day or two later, that the child had miraculously recovered, a testament to her skill as a healer. She was building a new narrative, a new reputation for herself as a worker of miracles, a woman who could save even the weakest of infants. At other times, when Thorne declared a perfectly healthy baby defective for some arbitrary reason, she would use the emetic. The violent vomiting would alarm the master, who, fearing a contagious disease that could sweep through the quarters and damage his other assets, would order the child and mother isolated. This quarantine gave Clara the opportunity she needed. Under the guise of delivering food and linens to the isolated cabin, she would smuggle the mother and child out in the dead of night to a predetermined spot on the edge of the property. There they would be met by conductors from the Underground Railroad, a connection Clara had secretly established through her church contacts in town. The mother and child would vanish, becoming ghosts. In the plantation logs, they were recorded as fled or, more often, succumbed to the flux and buried. Elias Thorne, consumed by his own arrogance, saw only what he wanted to see: a midwife whose skills were improving and a few unfortunate but expected losses. He had no idea his system of death was being systematically dismantled from within by the two women he disdained the most. This delicate and dangerous game of deception could not last forever. The number of miraculous recoveries and vanished mothers began to form a pattern that was too consistent to ignore. Elias Thorne was a man obsessed with data and efficiency. He noticed the anomalies in his own ledgers. His meticulously planned culling was failing. The infant mortality rate on his plantation was now, ironically, genuinely and remarkably low. His initial pride in this statistic soon gave way to suspicion. He was a predator who had grown accustomed to the taste of a successful hunt, and now his prey was inexplicably escaping. He started watching, his paranoia growing. He observed Phyllis more closely, noting the strange herbs she gathered, the unusual amount of time she spent with the newborns he had condemned. He watched his wife, Clara, noticing her newfound interest in the affairs of the slave quarters, her late-night walks, her increasingly confident and defiant demeanor. The threads of the conspiracy, invisible to him for so long, were slowly starting to become visible. The breaking point came with the birth of twins, a boy and a girl. Twins were often seen as a bad omen, and they were a logistical problem for an enslaved mother trying to work in the fields. The boy was born robust and healthy. The girl was smaller, quieter. Thorne immediately declared her unfortunate and ordered Phyllis to carry out the sentence. It was a direct test of her loyalty, a way for him to reassert his dominance. Phyllis knew she was being watched. She took the girl, along with Thorne's vial of poison, which Clara had been unable to intercept this time. The entire plantation held its breath. The mother wept in her cabin, believing she was about to lose her daughter, but Phyllis had one last, desperate gambit prepared for just such an occasion. She had spent months cultivating a relationship with Jepson's wife, a lonely and overlooked woman, by treating her chronic migraine with herbal remedies. She had earned a sliver of trust. That night, under the guise of delivering a sleeping draught to Jepson's wife, Phyllis secretly swapped the infant girl with the overseer's own newborn baby, who was of a similar size and complexion. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. If you find yourself holding your breath, wondering how such a forbidden act could possibly succeed, it's because these are the stories that have been deliberately buried. We dig them up. Subscribe to our channel to ensure these macabre histories are never forgotten. The infant swap was the most desperate gamble of Phyllis's life. She returned to the twins' mother with Jepson's child, swaddled and sleeping, claiming the girl was merely sedated. To Elias Thorne, she presented the smaller twin, the one he had condemned. She administered his poison, and the child died in her arms. It was a horrifying, necessary sacrifice to maintain her cover and save not only the other twin but the entire secret operation. The moral calculus was monstrous, a choice between one certain death and two. Thorne, witnessing the act, was satisfied. His authority was restored. His instrument was compliant. The anomaly was explained. He believed he had won. But the next morning, a frantic scream erupted from the overseer's house. Jepson's wife had woken to find her own child dead in its cradle, a victim of what the local doctor would later diagnose as sudden infant death, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. The irony was as thick as it was poisonous. Jepson, the brutal enforcer of Thorne's eugenics program, had become a victim of it. He was consumed by a grief so profound it shattered his brutal facade. He had lost his only child, his heir. The plantation was plunged into a state of shock and mourning, the tragedy in the overseer's house completely overshadowing the natural death of a slave infant. In the ensuing chaos, Phyllis and Clara were able to smuggle the surviving twin girl, along with her mother and brother, off the plantation and into the hands of the Underground Railroad. They had vanished forever. The operation had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Phyllis had been forced to kill a child with her own hands to save others. The sin she had spoken of to Clara in the smokehouse was no longer a metaphor. It was real, a fresh stain on her soul. She had outsmarted her master, but she had become the monster he had always wanted her to be. There was no victory, only varying degrees of damnation. The creepy, hollow feeling of that truth settled over the plantation, a curse far more real than any swamp spirit. The death of Jepson's child, while a personal tragedy for the overseer, had an unintended and dramatic consequence. It broke the man. The grief hollowed him out, replacing his rage with a deep, brooding melancholy. He began to drink heavily, his duties on the plantation neglected. He looked at the enslaved people he terrorized not with contempt, but with a new, unwelcome flicker of shared humanity. He had now felt the pain of losing a child, the same pain he had inflicted on them countless times without a second thought. This psychological collapse created a power vacuum at Viridian Manor. Without his loyal and brutal fist, Elias Thorne's control began to slip. Small acts of defiance in the fields went unpunished. Work slowed down. The precise, terrifying clockwork of the plantation began to rust. Thorne, furious at his overseer's weakness, was forced to take a more direct role in the day-to-day management of the field hands, a task he despised and for which he had little aptitude. This distraction, this pulling of his focus away from the slave quarters and toward the cotton fields, gave Clara and Phyllis the breathing room they desperately needed. The infant swap had been a horrifying success, but it was a tactic they could never repeat. They needed a more permanent solution. They needed to stop Elias Thorne for good. Their secret conversations in the woods took on a new, darker urgency. Sabotaging the poisoned shipments and swapping babies was no longer enough. The source of the evil, Elias himself, had to be dealt with. The thought, once unthinkable, was now spoken aloud in hushed, desperate whispers. How do you stop a monster who is protected by law, by society, by an entire economic system? The answer that began to form was as dark and as final as the poison Thorne himself favored. They had been trying to save the babies from his poison. Now, they considered using that same tool on him. The alliance born of a desire to save lives was now contemplating the ultimate sin, murder. The macabre tale was spiraling into its final, forbidden act. The idea of poisoning Elias Thorne was a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. For Clara, it represented the complete and utter destruction of her world and her morality. She was a God-fearing woman, the mistress of a great house. To murder her own husband was a sin of the highs. To order a path to eternal damnation. Yet, to allow him to continue his campaign of infanticide felt like a sin of its own. She was trapped in an impossible ethical dilemma, her soul stretched taut between two horrifying choices. Phyllis, on the other hand, approached the problem with a chilling pragmatism that was born of a lifetime of survival in a brutal world. She had already been forced to kill. Her hands were already stained. For her, the death of Elias Thorne was not a question of morality but of logistics. He was not a person. He was a disease that afflicted her people, and the only goal was to eradicate it. In their secret meetings, the two women debated the method. It had to be subtle, untraceable. It had to look like a natural death. Phyllis, with her encyclopedic knowledge of plants, knew of a dozen ways. There were mushrooms that mimicked the effects of a heart attack, ground-up seeds that induced a wasting sickness, leaves that, when steeped in his nightly brandy, would simply make his heart stop beating in his sleep. She laid out the options for Clara with the calm demeanor of a chef discussing a menu. This clinical approach to murder was deeply disturbing to Clara, highlighting the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their life experiences. Clara prevaricated, her mind reeling. She prayed for another way, a sign from God that would spare her from this terrible choice. But no sign came. The births continued, and with each new cry of a newborn, the pressure mounted. Thorne's paranoia was also returning. Jepson's continued decline meant security was lax, but Thorne's own suspicions were sharpening. He had started locking his study at night and tasting his food with a new, deliberate caution. Time was running out. They both knew that if they were going to act, it had to be soon. The question was no longer if, but how and when, and whether Clara could summon the courage or the desperation to give the final order. Decision was ultimately made for them. A young 16-year-old girl named Sarah, a house slave who worked directly under Clara, discovered she was pregnant. The father was a field hand she loved, a strong young man named Isaac, but the baby was conceived without Thorne's permission, an unforgivable act of defiance. When Thorne found out, his rage was cold and absolute. This was not just an unsanctioned birth. It was a challenge to his authority, a violation of his ownership over their very bodies. He made a horrifying public declaration in the main yard, forcing all the slaves to assemble and watch. He announced that if Sarah's child was born, he would not even bother to assess its worth. He would sell it immediately to a trader from the Deep South, a man known for his cruelty, ensuring the child would vanish into the sugar cane fields of Louisiana, a fate widely considered to be a death sentence. Furthermore, he would have Isaac whipped to within an inch of his life as punishment for his transgression. This public decree was a calculated act of terror, designed to reassert his dominance and crush the nascent spirit of resistance that had been growing on the plantation. For Clara, this was the final straw. It was one thing to murder infants in secret under the guise of eugenics. It was another to preemptively condemn an unborn child to a living hell out of sheer spite. It was the personification of his evil, laid bare for all to see. That night, she met Phyllis by the swamp. The debate was over. There was no more hesitation in her eyes, only a hard, glittering resolve. "Tonight," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "It has to be tonight." Phyllis simply nodded. She had been preparing for this moment. She produced a small leather pouch from her dress. Inside was a fine, dark powder, odorless and tasteless. It was derived from the water hemlock plant that grew in the swamp, a poison so potent, so fast-acting, that there would be no possibility of an antidote. It would induce a swift, violent convulsion, followed by a quick death, mimicking the symptoms of a sudden apoplectic fit, a common enough ailment for a man of Thorne's age and temperament. The plan was set. The forbidden act was about to be committed. The fate of Viridian Manor and everyone in it would be decided by the contents of this small leather pouch. The atmosphere in the great house that evening was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. Elias Thorne was in a foul mood, his rage over Sarah's pregnancy simmering just beneath the surface. He took his dinner alone in his study, as he often did when displeased. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The plan was simple, yet every step was fraught with peril. Clara's role was to prepare his customary after-dinner brandy. Her hands trembled as she poured the amber liquid into his favorite crystal snifter. The house was quiet, the other servants dismissed for the night. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a thunderclap. She walked the lawn. Hallway to his study, the glass cold against her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt like a ghost, a specter of vengeance haunting her own home. Phyllis was not in the house. Her presence would be too suspicious. Instead, she was hidden in the shadows of the garden just outside the study's French doors, watching, waiting. She was the architect of the poison, but Clara had to be the one to deliver it. It was a pact they had made. Clara had to be the one to physically sever the tie to her old life, to take the final, irrevocable step. She reached the study door and knocked. Thorne's voice, irritated and sharp, barked for her to enter. He sat at his desk, bathed in the warm glow of an oil lamp, his face a mask of stern concentration as he reviewed his ledgers. He looked up, his expression softening slightly at the sight of the brandy, his one nightly indulgence. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice returning to its usual tone of condescending affection. He was completely unaware that he was looking at his own executioner. Clara placed the snifter on his desk, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her mind was screaming, "Flee, stop, turn back." But she thought of the 12 small graves in the swamp. She thought of Sarah's unborn child, condemned before its first breath. She thought of the mothers with the hollowed-out eyes. She forced a smile, a grotesque parody of wifely devotion. "I thought you might enjoy it, Elias," she whispered. He picked up the glass, swirled the liquid, and brought it to his lips. Clara held her breath, her entire universe shrinking to that single, suspended moment in time. The moment stretched into an eternity. Elias Thorne paused, the glass just inches from his mouth. He sniffed the brandy, his brow furrowed. "Something smells different," he mused, more to himself than to Clara. "A new vintage." Clara's blood ran cold. Had he detected it? Was it over? She forced a nervous laugh. "It's the same one you always have, my dear. Perhaps it's just your mood." The explanation seemed to satisfy him. He was a man who trusted his own senses, but he was also a man of habit, and the habit of his nightly brandy was strong. He took a sip, then another, deeper one, draining half the glass. Clara watched, mesmerized by the banality of the act. This man, this monster, was being undone by a simple, quiet drink. She made a hasty excuse about checking on the kitchen and backed out of the room, her legs unsteady. She closed the heavy oak door behind her, leaning against it, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had done it. She had committed murder. She had damned her own soul. From her hiding place in the garden, Phyllis watched through the window. She saw Thorne finish the brandy, saw him set the glass down. She began to count the seconds in her head, timing the poison's known effects. The silence from the study was deafening. Then it was broken. A sharp, guttural cry. The sound of a chair scraping violently across the floor. A heavy, sickening thud as a body hit the polished wood. Phyllis did not wait to see more. She melted back into the shadows of the night, her work done. She was a ghost, leaving no trace. Inside, Clara stood frozen in the hallway, listening to the horrifying sounds from the study. The initial cry was followed by a series of choked, gasping noises, the sounds of a body in its final, violent throes. Then an unnerving, absolute silence fell over the house. It was over. Elias Thorne, the master of Viridian Manor, the architect of so much misery, was dead. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a profound, terrifying emptiness. The king was dead, but the dark kingdom he had built remained. The discovery of Elias Thorne's body the next morning sent shockwaves through the county, but not through Viridian Manor. Among the enslaved, the news was received with a quiet, stunned disbelief that slowly gave way to a deeply suppressed, unspoken relief. The oppressive weight that had hung over the plantation for years had suddenly, inexplicably lifted. Clara played the part of the grieving widow with chilling perfection. Her performance was flawless, her hysterics convincing enough to fool the local doctor and the neighboring planters who came to offer their condolences. The doctor, a portly, complacent man who had been a friend of Thorne's, conducted a cursory examination. Seeing the overturned chair, the contorted expression on Thorne's face, and knowing his friend's stressful nature and fondness for rich food and drink, he quickly pronounced the cause of death to be an apoplectic fit. No one questioned it. A man like Elias Thorne was not the sort to be murdered. He was the sort to be felled by his own success and choleric temperament. The verdict was natural causes. The case was closed before it was ever opened. In the days that followed, Clara moved with a ruthless efficiency that would have made her late husband proud. She was now the sole mistress of Viridian Manor. Her first act was to quietly dismiss Jepson, the broken overseer, giving him a small pension and sending him on his way, effectively erasing the last true loyalist of her husband's regime. Her second act was to summon Sarah and Isaac. In front of the assembled slaves, she declared that their child would be born free on Viridian soil, and that they were formally married in the eyes of God and the estate. It was a stunning reversal, an act of public clemency that solidified her new authority. It sent a clear message. The old ways, the ways of casual cruelty and arbitrary punishment, were over. The reign of terror had ended. A new, uncertain era had begun. But the secrets of the past still lay buried in the red Georgia soil, and the woman who kept those secrets, Phyllis, watched from the shadows, her role in this new world yet to be determined. With Elias gone and Clara in control, Viridian Manor underwent a transformation. The atmosphere of constant, grinding fear began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, fragile hope. Clara, burdened by her guilt and the horrifying knowledge of what her family's wealth was built on, dedicated herself to a quiet, radical reform. She could not legally free her slaves. The laws of Georgia and her husband's massive debts made that impossible, but she could change the conditions of their bondage. She ordered the rations increased. She reduced the working hours in the field. She decreed that families would no longer be separated and sold. These were small changes in the grand scheme of the Southern slave economy, but for the people of Veridian Manor, they were revolutionary. Her most significant change, however, concerned the role of Phyllis. The midwife, once a figure of terror and a secret executioner, was now elevated. Clara put her in charge of a new infirmary, a dedicated space for caring for the sick, the elderly, and most importantly, the mothers and their newborns. Phyllis was given resources, medicines, and, for the first time, the explicit authority to do everything in her power to save every single life. The infant mortality rate at Veridian Manor plummeted, this time for real. The plantation became known in the region for the unusual health and well-being of its slave population, a fact that other planters attributed to Clara's soft-hearted, foolish femininity, but which was, in reality, the result of a dark and bloody conspiracy. Phyllis and Clara continued to hold their shared secret, a silent, unbreakable bond between them. They were two sides of the same coin, a murderer and an accomplice who had committed a terrible act in the service of a greater good. The 12 small graves in the swamp remained undisturbed, a hidden monument to the horror that had precipitated this new era. The curse on the land had not been lifted, it had simply been transformed. The ghosts of the past were not gone, they were just quieter now, their silence bought with poison and a pact made in the dead of night. Years passed. The new order at Veridian Manor held, a strange island of relative humanity in the brutal sea of the antebellum South. Clara Thorne aged, her hair turning a premature white, the secret she carried etched into the lines on her face. She never remarried, dedicating her life to managing the plantation and atoning for her husband's sins in the only ways she could. Phyllis became a legend, the healer of Veridian, her name spoken with reverence and awe in slave quarters across the state. The old whispers of her being a baby killer faded into forgotten folklore, replaced by tales of her miraculous cures and her fierce protection of the children born under her care. The story, it seemed, was over. The evil had been vanquished and a fragile peace had been won. But history is never so neat. The past is never truly dead, and its ghosts have a way of returning. The catalyst for the unraveling came not from within the plantation, but from without. In the late 1830s, a young, ambitious doctor arrived in the county, fresh from medical school in Philadelphia. He was a man of the new science, a believer in autopsy and empirical evidence, and he held a deep contempt for what he considered the superstitious folk remedies of granny women like Phyllis. He heard the stories of Veridian Manor's impossibly low infant mortality rate and became suspicious. In a world where 1 in 3 enslaved infants died before their first birthday, Veridian's success was a statistical impossibility. He did not see a well-run infirmary, he saw a cover-up. He began to ask questions, to collect stories. He heard the old, half-forgotten rumors about Phyllis, the whispers that had been dormant for more than a decade. He spoke to disgruntled former overseers from neighboring plantations, men who resented the success of a plantation run by a woman. The old folklore, the creepy tales of babies vanishing under Phyllis's care, found a new and receptive audience. The young doctor was determined to expose what he believed to be a massive fraud, to bring down the legendary healer of Veridian and reveal her as a charlatan, or perhaps something far worse. The cold case, long thought buried and resolved, was about to be reopened. The young doctor, whose name was William Avery, began his investigation with a modern, scientific zeal that was utterly alien to the rural Georgia community. He was not interested in superstition or folklore, only in facts and bodies. He learned of the death of Elias Thorne, officially an apoplectic fit, and noted the coincidence of the plantation's reforms beginning immediately after. He interviewed former slaves who had been sold from Viridian years before, and he coaxed from them the old, fearful stories about fillies from the time before Clara's rule. But his breakthrough came when he spoke with the disgraced and alcoholic Jepson, the former overseer, who was living in poverty in a nearby town. Jepson, his mind clouded by years of cheap whiskey and resentment, told Avery a rambling, half-coherent story. He spoke of a macabre discovery in a cypress swamp, of small, unmarked graves, of a secret that Elias Thorne had tried to suppress. He didn't know the full truth, but he gave Avery the one thing he needed: a location, a place to dig. Armed with this information, Avery hired a few men and, under the cover of night, trespassed onto the Thorne property. He found the patch of fallow ground near the swamp, now overgrown with weeds and vines. He and his men began to dig. It didn't take long. The shovels struck wood. They unearthed the first of the small, rotting pine boxes, then another and another. By sunrise, the 12 tiny coffins, their contents now little more than dust and bone fragments, were lined up on the ground. Avery had his proof. He had uncovered a secret, mass grave of infants on the property of the celebrated Clara Thorne and her miracle-working midwife. He did not know the story behind it, the poison, the eugenics, the desperate choices. He saw only the horrifying, damning evidence. He believed he had uncovered the work of a serial killer, a monstrous midwife who had been murdering babies for decades while the world praised her as a saint. The forbidden history of Viridian Manor had been unearthed, but the truth was about to be buried under a new, more terrible lie. The discovery of the graves ignited a firestorm of scandal and horror throughout the county. Dr. Avery presented his findings to the local sheriff, and an official investigation was launched. The narrative that Avery spun was simple, sensational, and easy to believe. Phyllis, the powerful and mysterious slave midwife, was a monster. He painted her as a practitioner of some dark, forbidden African magic, a witch who murdered infants for her rituals. He claimed that Clara Thorne, a weak and sentimental woman, was either ignorant of the killings or a willing accomplice, her mind clouded by the midwife's sinister influence. This version of the story, with its racist undertones and sensationalist horror, was far more palatable to the white community than the complex, uncomfortable truth. It was a story about a rogue, savage slave, not a respected white planter who engaged in systematic eugenics. The full weight of the law, a system designed to protect property and uphold the racial hierarchy, came crashing down on Viridian Manor. The sheriff and his deputies arrived, and the plantation was turned upside down. Slaves were interrogated, terrorized into giving testimony that fit the doctor's narrative. They spoke of Phyllis's strange herbs, her solitary nature, her once feared reputation. Every piece of folklore was twisted into evidence against her. Clara Thorne's world crumbled. Her reforms were seen not as acts of compassion, but as part of a massive cover-up. Her reputation was destroyed overnight. She tried to tell the truth, to explain the impossible situation her husband had created, but no one would listen. To confess to murdering her husband to stop his crimes was unthinkable. Her testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a mad, hysterical woman trying to protect her pet slave. She was trapped. All she could do was deny everything, a denial that only made her look more guilty in the eyes of her accusers. The investigation was not a search for truth. It was a witch hunt, and it had already chosen its witch. The target was not the memory of the white master, but the life of the black midwife. The climax of the investigation was the arrest of Phyllis. She was taken in chains from her infirmary, the place where she had saved so many lives. She did not resist. She did not speak. As she was led away, she looked at Clara one last time, a look that conveyed a universe of shared secrets, sorrow, and understanding. It was a look that said, "Do not speak. Do not confess. Let them have me. Survive." The trial, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. It was a legal spectacle designed to reinforce the social order. A slave could not testify against a white person, but the testimony of white men like Dr. Avery and the coarse, twisted statements from other slaves were entered as irrefutable fact. The evidence was overwhelming, a mass grave of infants on a property where she was the sole midwife. The motive, according to the prosecution, was her savage nature and her practice of heathenish rites. The defense was non-existent. Phillies was a piece of property on trial for destroying other pieces of property. Throughout the proceedings, Phillies remained silent. She refused to speak in her own defense, refused to implicate Elias Thorne, refused to reveal the truth that would have also condemned Clara. Her silence was her final act of control, her final act of compassion for the woman who had been her unlikely co-conspirator. It was also an act of defiance. She would not give them the satisfaction of a confession. She would not participate in their theatrical lie. She would let them write their own ending to the story, knowing that the real, horrifying truth was a secret she would take to her grave. The verdict was delivered in less than an hour. Guilty. Guilty of the murder of 12 unnamed slave infants. The sentence was death by hanging. The curse of Viridian Manor, born in the secret evil of a white master, was to have its final, public chapter written on the body of a black woman. The day of Phillies' execution was a public event. People came from all over the county to witness the hanging of the infamous witch midwife of Viridian. It was a grim, carnival-like atmosphere, a spectacle of communal vengeance. Clara Thorne had been placed under house arrest, officially for her own protection, but in reality to prevent her from interfering. She was a pariah, her name and family legacy destroyed. From her window, she could see the gallows that had been erected in the main town square. She was forced to be a distant, helpless witness to the final act of their shared tragedy. Phillies was brought to the gallows, her step steady, her head held high. She scanned the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had once sought her healing touch, the people who now jeered and cursed her name. She showed no fear, no remorse, only a profound, weary resignation. She had lived her entire life navigating an impossible world, making impossible choices. This was just the last of them. When asked if she had any final words, she broke her long silence. Her voice, though quiet, carried with a strange authority over the hushed crowd. "You hang a woman," she said, her eyes seeming to find Clara's distant window, "but you cannot hang a secret. The red earth knows, and it does not forget." With those cryptic final words, the hood was placed over her head and the rope around her neck. The trapdoor swung open, and the legend of Phillies, the healer, the killer, the witch, was brought to a sudden, violent end. Her death served its purpose. The social order was restored. The uncomfortable mystery was solved. The white community could sleep soundly, knowing the monster had been punished. They had their scapegoat, their simple story of good versus evil. They had successfully taken a history of a white man's systematic, scientific evil and transformed it into a macabre folktale about a savage black woman. The truth, as Phillies had predicted, remained buried. In the aftermath of the execution, the final pieces of the Viridian Manor tragedy fell into place. The plantation, now deeply in debt and stained by scandal, was lost to the Thorne family. Clara, stripped of her home and her standing, vanished from the historical record. Some say she moved west, seeking anonymity on the frontier. Others whisper that, consumed by guilt and grief, she took her own life, drowning herself in the very swamp where the infants were buried, joining the ghosts she had helped create. Her fate remains an unsolved cold case, a final quiet mystery in a story full of them. Viridian Manor was sold, broken up, and its enslaved population scattered to the winds, sold off to pay Elias Thorne's creditors. The community that Clara and Phillies had forged, the fragile island of hope, was obliterated. The families Clara had vowed to keep together were torn apart, and the cycle of suffering and exploitation began anew under different masters. The land itself fell into ruin. The great house was eventually abandoned, its windows broken, its gardens overgrown. Locals claimed the place was cursed, haunted by the ghost of the executed midwife and the cries of the infants she had murdered. The story of the witch midwife became a local legend, a ghost story told to frighten children, its true, horrifying origins completely forgotten. The name of Elias Thorne was remembered as that of a respectable, if unfortunate, planter whose family fell on hard times. The name of Phillies was remembered as a synonym for evil. The lie had become history. The truth had vanished, Jew. And as Phillies had. The red Georgia earth held the secret, just as she said it would, keeping its silent, patient watch. What are we to make of this horrifying, macabre tale? On the surface, it is a cold case about a slave midwife who buried infants alive. It is a story of a haunted plantation, a secret graveyard, and a witch hunt. This is the version of the story that history has chosen to remember, a simple, chilling tale that is easy to tell and easy to condemn. But beneath this lurid surface lies a far more disturbing and forbidden truth. The real monster of Viridian Manor was not the woman who held the poison, but the man who ordered it. The true horror was not the secret burials in the swamp, but the cold, calculated eugenics program conceived in a rich man's study. The story of Phillies is not the story of a murderer, but of a woman forced into an impossible moral corner by a system of absolute evil. She was a healer forced to kill, a protector forced to become a monster to prevent even greater atrocities. Her choices were not between good and evil, but between different, unimaginable degrees of horror. This is the truth that the official record has tried to erase. It is a truth that is far more challenging to our understanding of the past. It replaces a simple, satisfying ghost story with a complex and deeply uncomfortable history of systemic cruelty, resistance, and the monstrous logic of slavery. The story forces us to ask, who was the real villain? The woman who took the lives of 12 infants under duress, or the man who created the system that demanded their deaths? And what of Clara Thorne, the woman who benefited from this system until she found the courage to conspire against it, using murder as her tool of liberation? There are no easy answers here. There are no clear heroes. There is only the deep, unsettling ambiguity of a history that is far darker and more complex than we are comfortable admitting. The land that was once Viridian Manor is now just anonymous farmland. The great house is gone, collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. The slave quarters have long since vanished, leaving no trace. Even the cypress swamp has been drained. But somewhere, under the neat rows of soybeans and corn beneath the deep, red Georgia soil, the ghosts of this story remain. The bones of the 12 infants may still be there, their secret graves lost to time. The spirit of Elias Thorne, a man whose evil was so profound it was erased by history and blamed on his victim, perhaps lingers as well. And what of Phillies, the woman who was both healer and killer, savior and sinner? Her final words on the gallows hang over this history like a shroud. You cannot hang a secret. She was right. The secret of Viridian Manor, the truth of a master's cold-blooded eugenics and the impossible choices he forced upon his slaves, was not destroyed on the gallows. It was merely buried, driven deep underground, where it festered in the darkness, waiting. Stories like this are often dismissed as folklore, as creepy tales to be told around a campfire. But they are more than that. They are the echoes of a forbidden history, a testament to crimes so horrifying that society has chosen to forget them, to replace them with simpler, more palatable lies. The true curse of Viridian Manor is not a supernatural one. It is the curse of willful ignorance, the curse of a history that has been sanitized and rewritten to protect the powerful and condemn the powerless. It is a curse that still haunts us today, reminding us that the most horrifying monsters are not figures from folklore, but real people, and the most disturbing tales are the ones that are true. The official narrative of the Viridian Manor incident is sealed. The court records document the trial and execution of the slave, Phillies, for the murder of 12 infants. Dr. William Avery was lauded for his scientific mind and his courage in exposing the witch midwife. The Thorne family name was cleared of any wrongdoing, their tragedy attributed to the misfortune of owning a defective and savage piece of property. History, as it is so often, was written by the victors. But for those who know where to look, for those who are willing to dig beneath the surface of the official story, the whispers of the truth remain. They persist in the fragmented oral histories passed down through generations of African American families in that region, stories of a healer who made terrible sacrifices, of a kind mistress who risked everything, and of a cruel master who got what he deserved. These are the banned histories, the truths that survive not in books, but in whispers. They tell a story not of a simple monster, but of a desperate and complex war fought in the shadows of a brutal system. They remind us that the line between victim and perpetrator, between hero and monster, can sometimes blur until it is almost invisible. It is a profoundly unsettling thought, the idea that acts of profound evil can be born from a twisted sense of compassion, and that justice can sometimes look an awful lot like murder. So the next time you hear a local ghost story or a creepy piece of folklore, pause for a moment. Ask yourself what horrifying truth that story might be designed to hide. Ask yourself what secrets the earth beneath your feet might be keeping. Because often, the most macabre tales are the ones that serve as a gravestone for a history that someone somewhere tried very hard to bury. And as Phyllis herself warned, the earth does not forget.